Hello, welcome. My name is Joshua Cole. I'm the director of the Center for European Studies here, and before I introduce our guest today, I just want to take advantage of your presence to make a couple announcements about some upcoming lectures that we have in the coming weeks. On Thursday, November 1st, as part of this very same series, The Conversations in Europe, Sakis Gekas, who is an assistant professor of history, modern Greek history at York University, will be speaking on the colonial Mediterranean and its place in European history. That's Thursday, November 1st at 4. On Monday, November 5th, also at 4 o'clock, Kathleen McNamara, an associate professor of government and foreign services at Georgetown University, will be giving a talk entitled, "It's the Politics, Stupid," explaining the Euro crisis. That one promises to be good. On Thursday, November 8th, again, as part of our Conversations on Europe series, we are very pleased to have not one, but two consuls, that is, representatives of their nation's government, the German consul in Chicago and the French consul in Chicago, will be coming to speak together, a kind of tag team exercise in Franco-German cooperation. The title of their presentation on November 8th is "The Challenges Facing Europe, a French-German Approach." And I should add that it is part of the task of consuls in countries to represent their government and to represent their government's cultural activities. They're very interested in meeting students and faculty during their presence here, and would be, I think, particularly interested to hear from faculty and students about what kinds of things they, as representatives of their nation's culture, can provide to people who are interested in Europe here. It's part of their own outreach program to come to universities and meet and talk with people. So if people are interested, please do come and let them know what you think. Finally, somebody I've actually invited myself, on Monday, November 12th, this is a little bit of an exceptional debate, from 4 to 6 p.m., we will have a Franco-Algerian filmmaker, Lamine Amar Kodja. Lamine is quite a young guy who has begun to make a name for himself as a documentary filmmaker in France and in Algeria. He has dual nationality and has made films in the past about the experience of Algerians and North Africans living in France. He happened to return to Algeria to live for an extended period of time in January 2011, when the events of the Arab Spring were first beginning to unfold. And he made a documentary film of this experience called Demande à ton ombre, Ask Your Shadow, which then effectively won a prize at a film festival on documentary film held in Marseille last year. And he's now on a tour of the United States. His film has been screened at the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art in New York City and also at a number of universities around the country. He will be here on November 12th in person in this room to screen the film, which is in French and in Arabic, but will have English subtitles. So please mark that date on your calendar. Now, today we have somebody here to speak on a quite a timely issue, although in some ways I would be hard-pressed to find a time in the last couple centuries when it wasn't a timely issue. That is the question of sameness and difference in democratic societies and the ways in which states in democratic societies should be permitted to keep track of their populations, and what kinds of sameness and difference matter, both to those populations themselves and to the states. Because this is clearly an important issue at a time right now when the question of affirmative action is once again heating up the national headlines. The University of Michigan was involved in a landmark case earlier in this decade. Now the University of Texas is going to probably be headed to the Supreme Court to discuss the question of affirmative action. It's particularly interesting to have a specialist in these issues come to the University of Michigan to give a comparative focus. So I'm very pleased then to introduce Morgane Labbé, who is a visiting professor this year at the University of Michigan, coming from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, the School of Advanced Study in Social Sciences. Professor Labbé is, in fact, a specialist in the history of social science, and in particular, the intersection of the social sciences, in particular demography, with questions of population and nationality in Central Europe. She's the author of a major study on nationality and population sciences entitled, I'll give you the French title first, La population à l'échelle des frontières, une démographie politique de l'Europe contemporaine. That is, population at the scale of national boundaries. I'll take a little bit of liberty in the translation. A political demography of contemporary Europe. She has published many, many articles in numerous European reviews on quite a wide range of related issues, the status of minorities in Poland, on the history of national boundaries and state statistics in 19th century Prussia, on race and nationality in the censuses of the Third Reich in Germany. Today, she will be speaking on the French debate on statistics and ethnic minorities, historical roots and present concerns. Please join me in welcoming Morgane Labbé. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming here, and thank you very much to the European Center, to Joshua Cole for the invitation. So, I will start with a little historical introduction in the 19th century, even though my talk will be about the present time. So let's start in 1860. It was at that time the International Statistical Congress held a new session in London and invited its members to address for the first time the difficult topic of how to standardize the population census. The Statistical Congress, the International Statistical Congress, was a prestigious institution that regularly in the 19th century gathered directors of the statistical offices together with administrators and leading scientists, economists, mathematicians, medical scientists. The ambition of the Congress was to unify statistics, and statistics in that 19th century was a high-valued scientific and administrative activity and language. And the aim of the Congress was in each session to issue recommendations that were expected to be applied in each country. During this session in London, as the members were discussing of the main information to collect in a census, in a population census, a small dispute occurred with the director of the French Statistical Office. He disagreed vigorously over a recommendation proposed by the German members concerning the record of the nationality in the census through an indirect question on language. The French director argued that the question on nationality, what meant for him as a French administrator citizenship exclusively, was already asked and didn't require an additional question. What for, he asked. Why asking about the language, since the information is given by the state, the language of the state? The report of the Congress didn't document further this discussion, but the case, the disagreement remained in the annals of the Congress as an instance of the growing tension between both countries at the end of the 19th century, France and Germany. Yet, the French director could be quieted, since eventually the Congress wouldn't select the question on nationality as a priority for a census. It would be only in 1872, in another session in St. Petersburg, that the question on nationality and ethnic nationality, it's clear now, would be introduced, and that time not by the German but the Russian statisticians. It would become an international recommendation. But since this recommendation had no authority, the Congress was just a consultative instance, but without real power, the recommendation was not, this recommendation was not applied in France. France didn't apply it, but it is not possible to say now, never apply it. The French director was far to imagine that 1 century and a half later, the French Statistical Office would change radically this inflexible French position, when it would propose, at its turn, to introduce an ethnic question in national surveys. Here again, the proposition arose dissensions, discussion, but that time not within the international, but the French community of statisticians and social scientists. What has been since identified, named the French polemic over the ethnic statistics began 2 decades ago. It emerged first in a small group of demographers and statisticians and spread out and included always more protagonists, whether from other scientific disciplines or other fields, intellectual, political, journalistic, and it spread out across institutions and regardless of traditional political lines. The polemic gave rise to decrees, laws, ministerial decisions, commissions, special issues of journal, workshop, reports, etc. An exceptional extension that invites us today to question its specificity, and in 2 respects to start with. Statistical indicators and their publication regularly trigger disputes and controversies. To take as an example the employment statistics or the price index. The dissension, the discussion, as you know, through the media, are acute but short, chronicle, I should say. By contrast, this polemic and the ethnic statistic was lasting and growing. Second respect, the issue of ethnicity in the statistic concerned other countries than France. Take the United States, but also in Europe, Great Britain, or other countries. Named ethnic, racial, or nationality or minority statistics according to the country, they are collected in population censuses or survey with more or less problems or discussions, but not with that degree and level that the polemic took in France. So the sharp, lasting, extended dimensions of this French polemic attest of a specificity. How to explain it? But which kind of specificity is it about? These are the questions underlying my talk. I will divide it in 2 parts. In the first part, I will give you a chronological narrative of the polemic. What I understand here, it's not only to describe the dissension, the discussion in itself, but rather to give an account of all the facts, the most salient facts that built the polemic over 2 decades. Statistical surveys, governmental commissions, immigration laws, etc. Then in a second part, I will focus more on the arguments and the counter-arguments of each side. Before to start, I will give you a short preamble and the record of nationality in the French population censuses, because it's necessary to know it to understand the following. So I mentioned that the reaction of the French director in London against any question and nationality other than citizenship in population census. But how was it exactly recorded in the 19th century and afterwards? Actually, the French population censuses started to register the nationality quite late, in the second half of the 19th century. Defined by the citizenship, the record of the nationality was based regularly and constantly on this legal distinction between citizens and foreigners, but with 3 possible answers, 3 options. They were the French by birth, so born from French parents, the filiation. They were the foreigner, and in between there were this category of French by naturalization. And these in-between categories became more and more important over the time, especially after a law issued in 1889 that introduced in the French legislation the so-called automatic naturalization of the foreigner born in France. And this form, this friend, changed very little over the time until the post-war and now today. They were just additional information about the country of birth, the previous citizenship, the date of arrival in France, but they brought precision to differentiate the foreigners, but in no case along ethnic lines. Just a remark, this traditional bipolar model differed significantly outside of France in the French colonial empire, and I will develop this point in my second part. So now, let's see the polemic in itself and its chronological development. The starting point of this polemic is given by a clear fact. It is a statistical survey led by the French Demographic Institute in 1992 on the social insertion of the immigrant population. The title of the survey was Geographical Mobility and Social Insertion. This survey was carried out by a department in this Demographic Institute specialized in the study of migration, and this department, where demographers and sociologists were working, conducted regularly statistical studies about migration. So at first sight, this survey was just a new survey, an additional survey, and nothing new had to keep the attention. Yet in another respect, external circumstances incited the demographers to break with a routine. It was the early 90s, and the last decade of the 1980s had experienced significant change in the migration policy of France with a new restriction. And the outcome, the evaluation of this policy, was controverted and fueled political debate. In the same time, the social condition of the immigrant population living in France had been worsening, deteriorating housing in segregated suburbs, school failures, underemployment. All these facts gave as much evidence that the so-called French model of integration of the foreign population was not working anymore. In this context, in 1989, the French government had already set out a new expertise committee called the High Council for Integration, Haut Conseil pour l'Intégration in French. As always, when it is about expert knowledge, statistical information was favored and expected to shed light on this new worrying situation. Therefore, this new council and the government were very interested with the project to conduct a survey on the immigrant population, and they backed it. But the survey didn't respond to the demand of the state. It just clearly mentioned that the survey will investigate more the problems of social integration of the immigrant population. This early political connection was not yet a motive of dividing social scientists, because there were a strong agreement on the necessity to find a concrete program, to promote integration again in the immigrant population. The division arose afterwards. Facing this new problem of how to investigate the failure of social insertion of the immigrant, The demographers working on this survey chose a new approach. They investigate the living condition of the immigrant population in a biographical perspective and collected a range of data about past migration, the marriage, the training and occupation to reconstitute what they called the trajectory of the immigrant. But with this new approach, they challenge also new methodological problems. The population concerned with this failure of integration was not only the immigrant population, but also, and even more, their children, the offspring, what we called the second generation. And due to the fact that this generation born in France get automatically, by naturalization, the French nationality, no indicator available enabled it to identify it, apart the foreign nationality of the parents. So the demographers made this kind of identification by the origin, and they delimitate what they call very clearly foreign population by origin, that they compare to a so-called French population by origin. So a first distinction that made social scientists quite inconfortable to this origin differentiation. Besides, because it was felt that a part of this failure of the integration was linked to cultural differences, and because the country of origin, even of the parents, was insufficient to inform about this so-called culture of origin, a question on language was asked in the survey, and she was introduced to identify what the demographers call clearly ethnic groups. It means that instead of distinguish Moroccans, Algerians, and Turks as before, they distinguish now Berbers, Kabyles, and Kurds. So two maybe small change, but they bring such a break with the French tradition of the statistics that they couldn't let a part of the community of the social scientists indifferent. Furthermore, several publications released the results of the survey, and they confirmed the will of the author to promote what they called the ethnic approach of migration. And they even claimed that they faced a mainstream thinking about social scientists and ideological position that denied the relevance of the notion of ethnicity for France, and therefore the diversity of the immigrant population and the problems of this population. So they used from the start a polemic tone, and they were also very self-confident because of this close political connection probably in their public and scientific duties, and that they were contributing to shape a new policy that will address the social problems of the immigrant by means of new statistics and tools. These declarations and publications brought about a wave, a surge of negative reactions, protestations from statisticians, social scientists, and sociologists. It was not the results at all. The results, the outcome were not commented, but the method and above all the terms, ethnicity, origin, French stem, français de souche. I don't know how to translate exactly.
Français de souche means
stem origin.
It refers to your roots. So français de souche is a way of, I mean, what it is, it's a way of saying a white population without using the
exactly.
terms.
And this, for some opponent, it was also a way. Some opponent, a few, but denounced very radically the return of a language of terms of some of racial nationalisms used in the past in France. So it exactly, in a way. But so a few denounced this language, but for the majority of the opponents, it was first and foremost this brutal break with an approach conform to the French political republican model, and also what was felt as the principle of organization of the French society. This division, still in the scientific community, became deep and acute, and instead of reaching an understanding, each side sought further support outside. So outside, it means in the media in France and in political groups. It's always the same. And as a result, the polemic expanded to a level unexpected. The polemic spread out in the public sphere, and I must say that it never withdrew from this public sphere. So an expansion that still today is difficult to understand for what I will call an expert controversy. And so this is related to this specificity I addressed at the beginning. But I just want to stress the influence of what I point out at the beginning, that is this close political connections of this issue and of this survey that we will see in the following of my talk. But just to point out, there is, in three respects, there is, since the beginning, this connection. First, the survey was related to growing doubt about the capacity of the traditional French model of integration of the immigrant. And at the end of the 80s, at the beginning of the 90s, this concern was increasingly present in the political discourse in French. And it was also due to the way the extreme right party challenged this issue. The second, in second respect, the survey was not made by academic institution. It was made by the Demographic Institute that had been in France always an institute favored by the state for political and ideological reasons, with a double statute, administrative and scientific. And at least since the onset, as I have told, there were interferences with governmental agencies, the High Council of Integration, and as the polemic spread out, further agencies, commission, committee, most of them governmental, came in addition. So there is this close connection. But I must say, in spite of this obvious political dimension of the polemic, the division, the split caused by the polemic within the community of social scientists or journalists or administrators never coincided with the traditional political lines. Why? Because the real issue was to recognize ethnic groups in the French population. And it hit the conception, of course, of the nation, of the French nation, as an indivisible collective. And it was even seen, and still today, as a threat to the Republican unity. And this conception, still deeply rooted, was shared by left-wing as right-wing parties. So very politicized, but absolutely not a political division right and left. That's at the turning of the 90s, the polemic led place to a status quo. Then, again, in the mid of the 2000s, it started again and opened to what is viewed as its second phase. It was a new phase due to a significant shift, not of the community, but of the external context. The issue of discrimination instead of integration now framed the debate over the immigrant population. The importance taken by this issue of discrimination in France resulted out range and may say, objective factors, change in the French society, social movements, growing influence of the European institution. Like the issue of integration, discrimination overcame the left-right political division and succeeded together politicians, researchers, and experts in a seemingly shared understanding of a crucial national issue cause. It reached quickly a first rank in the social and, in particular, the political agenda. And for the right-wing governments that ruled France in this decade 2000s, with more or less progressive or conservative tendency, combating discrimination became a political target. But first of all, it was the European institution that gave a significant start to this issue of discrimination as a political target. In 2000, new European directives against discrimination based on racial and ethnic origin were enacted. And France, as the other state members, had to conform to them. The next year, the French government issued a non-discrimination law, and in this law it was clearly specified so that it applied as well to the case of discrimination, so I quote, because of origin, belonging or not belonging, real or assumed, to an ethnic group, a nation, a race, and a religion. So on one side, it was impossible to speak about ethnicity in the statistic, but it was possible in the law because of this new European frame. The European directive imposed also each member state to create a special authority institute with the aim to record, so to make statistics, complaints of discrimination, and to provide the victims with help and protection. And accordingly, in 2004, the French government created this kind of authority of instance. But the topic of discrimination came also to the government agenda from another door, I must say. In 2005 occurred what is called I translate the outbreak of the suburbs, explosion des banlieues.
The violence of that broke out in the peripheral areas around the cities. When we say suburbs in France, you're speaking of
the residential, but the worst.
But in fact,
yes.
disadvantaged areas. We saw this in the media in 2005.
And as he said, so for the first time, this problem of urban segregation of the immigrant population, which was a reality, a fact, voiced in acts of violence, of collective violence against official buildings and in street battles against the police. And these urban riots, yes, signed, no, thank you, signed at the eyes of all political leaders, the real failure of the traditional model of integration. But the strategies of the government, which was in that time still a right-wing government, were double-sided. There is repressive replies on one side, and unexpected, I must say, from a right-wing government, an active promotion for a policy against discrimination, as far as it was about urban discrimination in the other side. And the Ministry of the Interior of that time, and afterwards President of the French Republic, Nicolas Sarkozy, was to personify this voluntary policy in all the sense of the words. And among the numerous declarations that he gave a lot of declarations and about this political issue, of course. It's about the issue of suburbs. He started to stress the need for information on I quote, the ethnic origin of the young people involved in these riots. So it is clear now that this year, 2005, marked a turning point opening, we say, to a period of voluntarism, institutional activism, full of declaration and promises. But the first significant change, so apart this declaration, came not from the state, but from the civil society. It was the creation of a completely new kind of organization in France, I translate, the Council of the Association of Black People, le Conseil des Associations Noires. It was like a federation gathering all the societies and associations representing in France the minorities coming from Africa and from the West Indies, but living in France. It was really something completely new. And just after its founding, this council undertook a survey for clearly numbering the black minority living in France, and this council collected in the same time evidence about discrimination that it justified by the urge to prove that discrimination existed in France. And it emphasized also the need for statistics. So the need for ethnic statistic, what he called later statistic of the diversity, came from a minority, not from a state. And it organized also a workshop with the title The Statistics of the Diversity that addressed clearly the issue of representing what was called the visible minorities. Nearly in the same period, from the state side, an important state expertise institution working for the Prime Minister was also created, Centre d'analyse stratégique. I don't know how to translate because already in French it's d'analyse stratégique.
It's a government?
Yes, it is a new form of the plan.
Yeah.
Institute of the Planification. Yeah. It's a center of analysis. It's an expert institution, but quite an important one, close to the government again. And this center organized another workshop on this topic of discrimination with a very similar title. The title was Ethnic Statistics. But its aim was to gather that time specialists from all the fields and to give place to a range of opinions for, against statistics, instead of the face-to-face of the previous decade. And very cautiously, but purposely, in its conclusion, the center described what he called point of consensus and making clearly appeared a change in the frame of the issue. It was not anymore about statistic of ethnicity, but the correct word was statistics of the discrimination. And with this new wordings, but also these new meanings that statistic was to be used for a policy against discrimination, a large part of the participants agreed for the first time on the need to produce this kind of statistics, even if it was not clear what about the ethno-racial reference of this, the ethno-racial dimension of this discrimination. While a consensus was almost reached among the group of the experts, the specialists, the next year, in 2007, the government, again, in the frame of the revision of the law on immigration, so mainly for new restrictions, issued a small additional article that specified the need for collecting data on the ethnic or racial origin of the foreigner to fight discrimination, not for control, to fight discrimination. And of course, the National Assembly was on the side of the government, voted the law. But the Constitutional Council rejected this article about the statistic, considered it as against the Constitution. And the reason was not, it's important, the protection of the individual at such a issue, but the principle of the indivisibility of the Republic again. The next year, in 2008, the French president again, which were now Nicolas Sarkozy, pronounced a discourse about the issue of equality. And this discourse could be viewed as a reaction to what was a defeat for him. The decision of the Constitutional Council was an opposition to a decision of the government. That time, the president selected cautiously his words, and dealing again with the topic of ethnic statistics, he spoke only about the problem of discrimination as challenging the real equality. He spoke about the challenge of the diversity of France, but no word about ethnicity. And he concluded with the necessity to have statistical tools. So the term tools also was a way to stress that it was statistic for a policy against discrimination. And he said it was necessary to have statistical tools to measure this diversity. The same year, the government initiated a new commission charged to make recommendations for the promotion of the diversity and equality of conditions. And this commission, at its turn, appointed a committee of specialists assigned with the task of making proposals in respect to, I quote again, the measure of diversity and discrimination. And a year later, this commission of specialists delivered its report with the title Inequalities and Discrimination for a Critical and Responsible Use of the Statistical Tool. A title, here again, that avoids, again, the word ethnicity. This committee, this is interesting to read, the report had, however, to manage this opposition of the Constitutional Council and wondered whether it was possible to measure discrimination, so ethno-racial discrimination, without any ethno-racial references. The problem was that most of the opponents had agreed for statistics of the diversity and discrimination. But in the same time, they emphasized their preference for what they called proxy variables of ethnicity. So not to ask directly a question about ethnicity, but to use what is called an indirect question on ethnicity. For instance, the country of birth of the parents is an indirect way, or the name, the patronym, an indirect way to inform about something like origin. And this committee was not stupid. He knows that behind the word, it was exactly the same issue. And challenging the decision of the Constitutional Council, that was the point, the committee drew attention that using these so-called proxy variables, indirect variables, was also actually to make ethnic differentiation, because it was to put aside the French by naturalization or according to the country of birth, and the other one. So it was to make a difference by origin. And the committee concluded, a little provocative, that if we agree that origin, it's ethnic origin, since the 19th century, the French census was both republic and ethnic. So the committee considered that more seriously, the issue was not about the ethnic origin. The origin was already recorded, but the kind of ethnicity it was about. And in this respect, he pointed out a confusion made in the debate between both approach using this English word, colorblind and origin blind. So he contended that the French census was not origin blind, but it was colorblind. And it was also the point because the discrimination was made also with the color, with the physical appearance of the individual. The consensus was spreading out, but just to say that as it didn't prevail everywhere, and in reaction of this committee, a group of social scientists resisting to the consensus founded an alternative and independent commission, and they denounced also through the media and the politics the compromise of researchers with the government, with the right government. And they contended that they would work alternative proposal. They couldn't disagree with the aim to combat discrimination. So they just contended that they could find better way to measure discrimination. So we see that the polemic change because there are steps of agreement. So just before going to the end of this first party, it is important to say that during that second decade, the activities of the demographers were not limited to state consulting activities on the issue of discrimination and migration. And in 2008, a new national statistical survey, named that time Trajectory and Origin Survey on the Diversity of the Population in France, was conducted again by the Demographic Institute. And like the previous survey, it was a biographical survey which recorded a range of information on the immigrants and their children. But that time, the terms ethnicity had completely vanished, and it was discrimination, the major topic, the crucial topic. And just to quote the authors, they said, the implementation of policies for equalities and against discrimination linked with origin required tools. So we see completely a new phrasing, a new vocabulary in this survey. So tools, equalities, discrimination, and implement a policy. Discrimination was addressed through questions over the individual experience. And in particular, it was asked about experienced discrimination of the individual in various places of the daily life. So in the occupation, at work, at school, at administration, and even in the discotheque. And interestingly, it was also asked about the ground of this discrimination, and there were a list of possible answers, and it was proposed for the first time to answer because of origin or because of skin color. And there were also a question about racism, whether the individual had been victim of racism, so something quite new. But the point is that there was no direct information on ethnicity. And we see that the survey had to conform to this legal frame of the constitutional council. And probably he had to give up a previous question because of this decision. So, as far as now the issue was about discrimination, there were something like a consensus, and the publications didn't reopen the polemic. So everybody agrees that discrimination is expanding in France, and with the necessity to find a policy to combat it. And that's the reason I close this first chronological part here. And I will focus on the arguments of each side of these polemics. I will just develop what seems to me 4 important groups of arguments. The arguments around over the conception, the definition of the nation, arguments around the issue of statistical categories and their so-called power, argument about the tools to measurement tools, and at least arguments about the statistical experience with ethnicity in the past or abroad. First, the argument about the political conception of the nation. The opponents to the introduction of ethnic groups in the statistical French statistics argued first and foremost that it would be contrary to the French political model based on the principle of the indivisibility of the Republic. The Republic is one and sovereign. And this is also the first article of the French Constitution since the revolutionary period, and that remained in its revision. And it is also the basis of some universalism of the equality of all the citizens. All the citizens are equal regardless of their religion, race, nation, etc. But it was the first argument of the opponents. But it was also the reason, the source of a counter-argument of the advocates of the ethnic statistic. They denounced, as far as it was about discrimination, they denounced what they call the fiction of the Constitution, because it was challenged with the reality, and the reality, what was the term real equalities everywhere spelled out, was a proof that it was a fiction, that it was a lie. Behind the Constitution, the reality is absolutely a contradiction. A second group of argument. The opponents to the ethnic statistic drew the attention to the fact that the recognition of ethnic groups, even by the statistics, would expose the French society to the threat of being organized by community, I don't know, communautarism, ethnic
multiculturalism.
Multiculturalism. And
which was presented as a danger.
Yes, it was absolutely seen, and still today, as a threat to the unity, and also to ethnicization, you can say, of social relation. And the reason of this fear lies in a recurrent argument against the ethnic statistics that assumes the power of the statistical categories to shape or to build the reality. So it is known in social, the construction of the reality. And in particular, in this case, because it was categories, scientific and official. As far as it is about survey and census, it is administrative institution, so state administration. So the power to influence the reality. But here again, we find counter-argument by the advocates of the ethnic statistic. They replied, of course, that ethnic or racial discrimination pre-existed to statistical categories, and that, at least in France, discrimination was not built by statistics, but by social relation, by institutions, by racism. And this very point convinced many of the opponents, of the moderate opponents, that it was eventually necessary to have statistics about racial ethnic discrimination. But as far as it was about discrimination, nevertheless, these moderate opponents, so these convinced opponents, resigned opponents, remained very reluctant to make use of ethnic and racial categories. And they argued at the time that these groups have not this clear-cut reality in the French society. And in particular, there were sociologists of the migration taking part in the debate And they emphasize that in the reality, the process of identification in the immigrant population is much more complex than to belong to one community. It's plural, it's moving. And of course, they denounced in the statistical categories something which would be not a lie, but a simplification of the sociological reality. The need for measures. Interestingly, the demographers in favor of ethnic statistics didn't really respond, didn't address what I call an epistemological challenge of the sociologists. What about the reality? The simplification, we agree that it is a simplification. And the statisticians, the demographer, they shift what I call a realistic argument. What is the best way to report on the reality? So this is the point. And they say that statistics is important, is valuable, because it is an indisputable proof of the reality. So the issue is not to describe, it's to prove. And the statistics not only counting, but they refer, of course, with expertise. So it was also a challenge between the disciplines that with their probability or statistical reasoning, that they can prove that such or such difference is correlated with origin or the physical appearance or not. They put the argument, the discussion, on another field. And they use also the word of tools. The statistic is useful as a tools to implement, to govern, to monitoring. It was this new English term came in the debate, to monitor the policy against discrimination. And at least, so I go quickly from a group of arguments to another one. And now this fourth group of argument, important also in the discussion, this is the other statistical experience with ethnicity. This group of arguments were very mentioned, very present in the polemic. Either it was about the past or about the present survey abroad. First, the past population census. The experience of the pre-war period played a significant role in the polemic, because it turned out that exactly in this decade, 90s, a number of research studies investigated for the first time the use of ethnic and racial statistics under dictatorship. And this survey highlighted the clear contribution of statistical system and statistics in the persecution of minorities. So it was clearly documented for the Nazi Germany, but also most of the European countries under the German occupation, also in the Soviet Union, and even recently in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. So the results were very striking, and they point out the thin and weak protection of individual data in the statistical system, even when these data were recorded under a democratic regime. And France, for other reasons than individual protection, opposed to any collection of record of data on ethnicity. But in two cases, France also in the past diverged from this rule. And these cases, this instance, were also clearly evidenced in this decade of 1990s by the work of researchers and special commissions. The first experience, it was under the Nazi occupation, when the French regime of Vichy cooperated with the Nazi German authorities for making censuses and files of the Jewish population. And the administration in charge, to the police but not exclusively, with the contribution of zealous statisticians, turned out to be, in that case, far from opposing to racial and religious mention within the French population and French citizens. Second case, in the past of the France, the censuses in the colonial empire, which relied heavily on ethnic and racial criteria, whether the matter was to identify, to count, or to classify the local population. The French colonial empire extended on various territories, Africa, Asia, West Indies, and there were no unified frame for these colonial statistics, but a large range of practices, but also common principles that ruled the census. First of all, there were everywhere a separation, a clear separation between the European and the non-European population. And that separation coincided with racial categories. It was often the definition, the European as the white population. It included also the American, so it was completely clear. Even though the population was divided along a hierarchy of status and rights relating to the land, to taxes, or to the labor force. And in this frame, the local population was excluded and was defined with a special status called indigenous. But what means indigenous? They were excluded from any European nationality citizenship, but also deprived from any nationality, local nationality, because it was a colonial occupation. And they were named indigenous. And when the statistical administration want to give a detailed account of this indigenous, they use ethnic categories. So these two cases, but I can develop in the discussion. I tested absolutely to the eyes of the post-war demographer or polemicist the limits and contradiction of the so-called French universal model. And it is important to have in mind that in the post-war, mass migration to France were coming first from the former colonies. And when it came about to introduce a distinction along ethnic lines in this population of immigrants, it was, of course, an echo of this past practice of the colonial past. Even if it was completely in a different context, it was difficult not to link both practices. And now the experience of the present time were used in this polemic, and in particular the American and the British population census. To undermine the objections of the opponents, the demographers in favor of ethnic statistics gave often, so it's an argument to comfort their position, foreign instances, and they emphasize that a majority of countries collect data on ethnicity in surveys. And they described, in particular, the British census that had introduced in the last two censuses and so-called ethnic question in relation with a new anti-discrimination policy. The question was debated, but finally would be asked without trouble. And to this argument, it is interesting to see the game or the play of the argument and counter-argument. The opponents just, instead to be quiet with this argument, the opponents to ethnic statistics saw what they call the influence, the negative influence of the Anglo-Saxon social and intellectual models on the French society. And especially they point out the young French sociologists, the new category, eager to follow the mainstream American sociology with its ethnic categories. It's really, I find it in the papers. And they point out how misleading it would be to adapt foreign schemes to the French society. So unique. And what replied, at least, the young French sociologist? They conveyed new arguments, and that time that would eventually, what I could undermine this so-called specificity of the French political model. And very clearly, they said that due to its colonial past, due to the mass migration of the post-war, there is also in French ethno-racial relationship in the society. There were also racism, and in the same degree, in the same level that in Britain or the United States. They didn't see any difference in the French society than in the British or the American. And second, they simply say there is the fact of the present, like other Western countries, France is becoming a multicultural society because the mass migration waves of the post-war that increase significantly the diversity of the population. So the fact is the diversity of the population. So the real problem is to recognize this new diversity coming from migration, instead rather to blame statistics whose function is to represent diversity. And so with these words, I stop my talk, and without conclusion, because I think that the discussion will bring some remarks, conclusive remarks. I thank you very much for your patience.